For 20 years, I believed I was part of God's chosen people, until the day I discovered that the man preaching holiness was hiding a dark secret behind the church doors. Women were manipulated, silenced, and abused in the name of faith. But what I exposed before the congregation changed everything forever. My name is Elizabeth, and for over 20 years, I lived believing I was part of God's chosen people. Every Saturday morning at 5 o'clock sharp, I would wake to the sound of my small alarm clock ticking on the wooden nightstand beside my bed. The house would still be wrapped in that peaceful silence that comes just before dawn, when even the birds haven't yet begun their morning songs. I would slip quietly from beneath my handmade quilt, careful not to wake my husband Robert, and pad barefoot across the cold linoleum floor to my modest closet. The ritual was always the same. I would reach for one of my 3 long skirts, the navy blue one for regular Sabbaths, the charcoal gray for communion services, or the deep burgundy for special occasions. The church had very clear guidelines about modest dress, and I followed them with the devotion of someone who truly believed that every detail mattered to God. No makeup was allowed, no jewelry except for my simple wedding band, and certainly no pants. Those were considered an abomination, a sign of worldliness that would separate us from our Heavenly Father. After dressing, I would walk the 8 blocks from our small ranch house on Maple Street to the Seventh-day Adventist church that sat like a beacon of hope on the corner of Main and Fifth. The building itself was unremarkable. Red brick, white trim, a modest steeple that reached toward heaven with humble determination. But to me, it represented everything pure and sacred in this fallen world. Our town of Cedar Valley wasn't much to look at. Population 3,200 according to the welcome sign, though that number had been painted over so many times, I suspected it hadn't been accurate in decades. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local diner served as the unofficial town hall, and where changing your religion was enough to make you the subject of whispered conversations at the grocery store for months. The Adventist church was considered somewhat exotic in our predominantly Methodist and Baptist community. We were the people who worshipped on Saturday instead of Sunday, who refused to eat pork or shellfish, who didn't celebrate Christmas or Easter the way everyone else did. Some folks in town viewed us with suspicion, others with curiosity, but most simply ignored us as long as we kept to ourselves. And we did keep to ourselves, largely because Pastor David Richardson taught us that friendship with the world was enmity with God. He was a man of average height but commanding presence, with steel gray hair that he kept meticulously combed and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. When Pastor David spoke from the pulpit, his voice carried the authority of someone who spoke directly for the Almighty. His sermons were peppered with dire warnings about the end times, the mark of the beast, and the narrow path that led to salvation. "Remember, beloved," he would say, his gaze sweeping across our small congregation of about 40 faithful members. "We are a peculiar people, chosen by God to be His remnant in these last days. The world will hate you because you are not of this world." Those words made me feel special, chosen, set apart for a divine purpose. I wore our differences like a badge of honor. When my old high school friends invited me to their Sunday barbecues, I politely declined, explaining that I couldn't eat their food or fellowship with those who didn't share our sacred truths. When neighbors asked why I didn't attend the community Christmas pageant, I patiently explained that December 25th was actually a pagan holiday that true Christians shouldn't observe. My daily routine revolved entirely around the church schedule. Monday evenings were for personal Bible study. Tuesday nights, the women's auxiliary met in the church basement to plan potluck meals and discuss modest dress standards. Wednesday brought prayer meeting, where we would spend 2 hours on our knees, sometimes weeping as we pleaded with God to open the hearts of our unconverted family members. Thursday evenings were reserved for visitation, going door to door in pairs, sharing our literature, and inviting people to upcoming evangelistic meetings. Friday sundown marked the beginning of the Sabbath, and from that moment until Saturday sundown, we observed the 4th commandment with scrupulous care. No cooking, no cleaning, no shopping, no entertainment that wasn't specifically religious in nature. We spent Sabbath afternoon reading Ellen White's writings, studying our Sabbath school lessons, or taking nature walks while discussing God's creation. Sunday through Thursday, I worked part-time at the local library, a job I'd taken specifically because it allowed me to be home in time for all our church activities. The head librarian, Mrs. Henderson, was Methodist and occasionally made comments about our unusual beliefs. But she was kind enough and never pressed the issue when I asked for Friday afternoons off to prepare for Sabbath. Robert worked construction and brought home enough money for us to live simply but comfortably. We had been married for 12 years but remained childless, something Pastor David assured us was part of God's plan, though he suggested we pray more earnestly about it. Perhaps, he had said during one of our pastoral counseling sessions, the Lord is preparing you for a different kind of service to his church. Our little house was decorated with religious artwork, biblical scenes painted on canvas, framed texts of Scripture, and several portraits of Jesus that followed you with their eyes no matter where you stood in the room. We owned no television, no radio, except for the one that received the Adventist Broadcasting Network, and no books except for our Bibles, Ellen White's complete works, and various church publications. Looking back now, I can see how completely our lives were controlled by the church structure, but at the time, it felt like freedom. Freedom from the moral confusion of the outside world, freedom from the pressure to conform to worldly standards, freedom from the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what God expected from us. Pastor David made everything crystal clear. He had answers for every question, biblical texts for every situation, and prophetic insight into the signs of the times. When world events unfolded, he would point to specific prophecies that proved we were living in the final moments of Earth's history. When members faced personal struggles, he provided counsel that always aligned perfectly with church doctrine. The first hint that something might be amiss came on a warm Saturday morning in early September. I had arrived at church earlier than usual to help prepare communion, and I noticed Pastor David speaking quietly with Sarah Mitchell, one of our newer members. Sarah was a young mother whose husband had recently left her, and Pastor David had been providing her with special spiritual guidance to help her through this difficult time. As I arranged the unleavened bread on silver plates, I couldn't help but notice how close Pastor David was standing to Sarah, how his hand lingered on her shoulder as he spoke. There was something about the intimacy of their conversation that made me uncomfortable, though I quickly pushed the feeling aside. After all, this was our spiritual leader, a man called by God to shepherd his flock. Surely any discomfort I felt was just Satan trying to plant seeds of suspicion in my mind. "Elizabeth," Pastor David called out as he noticed me watching, "how wonderful that you're here early. Could you help Sister Sarah understand the proper way to prepare her heart for communion?" I nodded and approached them, but something in Pastor David's eyes, a quick flash of what almost looked like annoyance at my interruption, stayed with me throughout the service that day. That small moment of unease was my first glimpse behind the carefully constructed facade of our perfect spiritual community. If I had known then what I would discover in the months ahead, I might have paid closer attention to that inner warning. But faith, as I had been taught, meant trusting completely and questioning nothing. The truth, when it finally came to light, would shatter not just my world, but the lives of dozens of women who had trusted their souls to a man who wore the mask of holiness while harboring the heart of a predator. To understand how deeply Pastor David Richardson had woven himself into the fabric of our lives, you need to know who I was before I began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. I was Elizabeth Margaret Thornton, born in 1962 in a small farming community about 50 miles from Cedar Valley. My maiden name was Sullivan, and I came from a long line of Irish Catholic immigrants who had settled in the Midwest during the potato famine of the 1840s. My conversion to Adventism at age 19 had been a source of tremendous pain for my family. My mother, Patricia Sullivan, had wept for days when I announced I was leaving the Catholic Church to join what she called that strange Saturday cult. My father, Thomas, a man of few words who worked the railroad for 43 years, simply stopped speaking to me for 6 months. Even now, 15 years later, family gatherings remained strained, marked by carefully avoided topics and the kind of polite distance that breaks hearts slowly over time. I had met Robert at an Adventist evangelistic series held in the Cedar Valley Community Center during the spring of 1983. He was 26 then, 4 years older than me, with gentle brown eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. Robert had grown up Adventist, a third-generation member whose grandfather had been converted by one of the church's pioneer evangelists back in the 1920s. His faith was quieter than mine, less intense, worn comfortable like an old sweater rather than brandished like a sword. Our courtship followed strict church guidelines. We were never alone together without a chaperone, never engaged in physical contact beyond holding hands, and spent most of our time together at church functions or in Bible study. Pastor David, who had arrived at our church just 2 months before I met Robert, took a special interest in guiding our relationship. He counseled us weekly, teaching us about Christian marriage, the proper roles of husband and wife, and the sacred responsibility of raising children in the Adventist faith. "Brother Robert," Pastor David would say during these sessions, his voice carrying that mixture of warmth and authority that made everything he said seem divinely inspired. "Your role is to be the spiritual head of your home. God will hold you accountable for your wife's spiritual development." Then he would turn to me with those penetrating gray eyes and add, "And Sister Elizabeth, your highest calling is to support your husband's leadership and create a haven of peace where he can rest from the battles of this world." I absorbed these teachings eagerly. After years of feeling spiritually homeless, caught between my Catholic roots and my growing conviction that the Adventist message was truth, I craved the certainty that Pastor David provided. He had attended the church's seminary, had spent years studying theology and prophecy, had been personally ordained by the conference president. When he spoke, I believed I was hearing the very voice of God. Our wedding in November 1984 was a small affair held in the church sanctuary, with about 30 members in attendance. Pastor David performed the ceremony, weaving scripture and church doctrine seamlessly into his homily about Christian marriage. He spoke about submission and headship, about the sacred trust between husband and wife, about the need to maintain purity even within marriage. Some of his words made me slightly uncomfortable, particularly his detailed discussions about physical intimacy, but I attributed my discomfort to maidenly shyness rather than anything inappropriate. The early years of our marriage were peaceful, if somewhat isolated. Robert worked long hours on construction sites, often leaving before dawn and returning after sunset, covered in sawdust and concrete dust. I kept house with the meticulous care that I believed honored God, following the detailed guidelines Pastor David had provided about everything from meal planning to household cleanliness. Every surface in our home gleamed, every meal was prepared according to the Adventist dietary laws, every moment was lived in conscious submission to divine will as interpreted by our spiritual leader. Pastor David himself was a complex figure who seemed to embody the perfect Christian leader. He was 52 years old when he came to our church, having served congregations in 3 other states during his 20-year ministerial career. His wife, Margaret, was a quiet woman who dressed modestly and spoke little during social gatherings. She taught the children's Sabbath school class and played piano for our church services, but always seemed to fade into the background whenever Pastor David was present. The pastor had a gift for making each member feel uniquely special and spiritually significant. He remembered everyone's birthday, inquired about family members by name, and had an uncanny ability to recall personal details from conversations that had occurred months earlier. When Sister Thompson's mother died, he spent hours at the funeral home, comforting the family and organizing meals for the grieving household. When Brother Martinez lost his job, Pastor David made phone calls to church members in other towns, networking until he found new employment opportunities. But it was with the women of the congregation that Pastor David seemed to have his greatest ministry impact. He would often say that women were naturally more spiritual than men, more sensitive to the Holy Spirit's leading, and therefore needed more careful guidance to channel their spiritual gifts appropriately. He instituted special prayer meetings for the ladies, held every Wednesday afternoon in his church office, where he would provide what he called advanced spiritual counseling. These sessions were invitation only, reserved for women who demonstrated exceptional spiritual maturity or who were facing particular challenges in their Christian walk. Being selected for these meetings was considered a tremendous honor, a sign that Pastor David saw special potential in your spiritual development. The women who attended spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the profound insights they received, the personal prophecies Pastor David shared with them, the deep spiritual breakthroughs they experienced under his guidance. Sarah Mitchell, the young mother I had noticed that morning, was one of Pastor David's most frequent counselees. She had joined our church 6 months earlier, a refugee from an abusive marriage seeking solace in our close-knit community. Sarah was 24 years old, with shoulder-length blonde hair that she kept pulled back in a simple bun, and blue eyes that often seemed clouded with the kind of sadness that comes from carrying too much pain at too young an age. Pastor David had taken Sarah under his wing immediately, explaining to the congregation that she needed extra support as she healed from the trauma of her broken marriage. He arranged for church members to help with childcare for her 3-year-old daughter, organized financial assistance to help with rent and groceries, and scheduled regular counseling sessions to address what he termed her spiritual and emotional recovery. "Sister Sarah has been wounded by the world," he announced during one Wednesday evening prayer meeting. "But God has brought her to us so that she might experience true Christian love and proper spiritual authority for the first time in her life. We must all do our part to show her what godly relationships look like." I admired Pastor David's compassion for Sarah and tried to befriend her myself, but she seemed withdrawn, almost fearful of forming close relationships with other women in the church. When I invited her for coffee or offered to watch her daughter so she could run errands, she would politely decline, explaining that Pastor David had advised her to focus on her healing rather than developing social connections that might distract from her spiritual growth. Another regular attendee of Pastor David's special counseling sessions was Linda Chen, a recent convert whose Chinese immigrant parents had disowned her for leaving Buddhism to embrace Christianity. Linda was pursuing a nursing degree at the community college and working part-time at the local hospital to support herself. She was intelligent, articulate, and deeply committed to her newfound faith, but Pastor David expressed concern about her independent spirit and what he called her feminist tendencies. "Sister Linda comes from a culture that doesn't properly understand biblical womanhood," he explained to Robert and me during one of our monthly dinner visits to the parsonage. "She's been influenced by worldly ideas about women's roles, and it's taking considerable effort to help her understand God's design for feminine submission. But praise the Lord, she's making progress under proper spiritual guidance." Linda had indeed changed during her months under Pastor David's mentorship. The confident, animated young woman who had first attended our church had become quieter, more deferential, constantly seeking approval before expressing any opinion or making any decision. When she did speak during church services or social gatherings, her comments were always prefaced with phrases like, "Pastor David has helped me understand that," or, "I've learned from my spiritual counseling that." Then there was Helen Rodriguez, a widow in her 40s whose husband had died in a farming accident 2 years earlier. Helen owned a small piece of land on the outskirts of town and had been struggling to maintain the property and support herself through part-time work at the post office. Pastor David had organized church work parties to help with repairs and maintenance on her property, but he also insisted that Helen needed ongoing spiritual support to deal with what he termed the particular temptations that face women without proper male headship. Helen attended Pastor David's counseling sessions twice weekly, and I noticed that she often seemed emotionally drained after these meetings. When I asked if she was finding the sessions helpful, she would give vague answers about working through deep spiritual issues and learning to surrender areas of independence that weren't pleasing to God. The pattern was becoming clear, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Pastor David seemed particularly drawn to women who were vulnerable, whether due to broken relationships, financial struggles, family conflicts, or cultural displacement. He positioned himself as their spiritual father, the one person who truly understood their needs and could guide them toward healing and proper Christian womanhood. But there were other women in our congregation who seemed to exist on the periphery of Pastor David's attention. The older married women like myself received general pastoral care, but were never invited to the special counseling sessions. Women who were financially stable, emotionally confident, or who had strong support systems from their families rarely warranted the intensive spiritual guidance that Pastor David lavished on the more vulnerable members. Mrs. Peterson, a retired school teacher whose husband was a deacon, once commented privately to me that she found it odd how much time Pastor David spent counseling the younger women. "In my day," she said with a slight frown, "pastors didn't spend so much time alone with female parishioners. It just wasn't considered appropriate, even for the most spiritual purposes." I had dismissed her concerns as old-fashioned thinking, the product of a generation that didn't properly understand the deeper spiritual ministries that modern pastoral care required. Pastor David had explained to us that his counseling methods were based on advanced training he had received at the seminary, techniques that previous generations of ministers hadn't been taught. He often spoke about the special anointing God had given him for ministering to wounded women, comparing himself to Jesus' compassionate care for the women who followed him. The church members trusted Pastor David completely, and why shouldn't we? He preached powerful sermons that moved us to tears, led prayer meetings where we felt the very presence of God, and demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of Scripture and prophecy that seemed truly inspired. When he spoke about end-time events, his predictions aligned perfectly with current world events. When he counseled families facing difficulties, his advice seemed to bring peace and resolution. More importantly, our church was growing under his leadership. New members joined regularly, attendance at midweek services increased, and the financial offerings were strong enough to support building improvements and expanded outreach programs. By every measure that mattered to church administrators, Pastor David Richardson was a successful minister who was effectively building God's kingdom in Cedar Valley. But success, as I would later learn, can be the perfect camouflage for the most dangerous predators. The very qualities that made Pastor David an effective leader, his charisma, his spiritual authority, his ability to inspire trust and devotion, were the same tools he was using to manipulate and exploit the women who looked to him for guidance and protection. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs through our daily interactions. But I was too trusting, too invested in believing that our spiritual leader was everything he appeared to be. It would take a crisis in my own life to finally open my eyes to the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The first crack in my unwavering faith in Pastor David came on a humid Thursday evening in July when I arrived early at church for our weekly visitation preparation meeting. The summer heat had been oppressive that week, the kind that makes the air feel thick as honey and causes everyone to move a little slower, speak a little softer. I had finished my library duties an hour early and decided to stop by the church to organize the visitation materials before the other members arrived. As I approached the side entrance that led directly to the education wing, I heard voices coming from Pastor David's office. The door was slightly ajar, which struck me as unusual since he typically kept it closed during his counseling sessions. Something in the tone of the conversation made me pause, though I couldn't immediately identify what felt wrong. "You don't understand how much I care about your spiritual development, Sarah." Pastor David's voice carried that familiar warmth, but there was an undertone I had never heard before, something almost intimate, possessive. "God has given me special insight into your needs, insights that others couldn't possibly understand." I heard Sarah's voice, smaller, more hesitant than usual. "Pastor, I appreciate everything you've done for me, but sometimes I feel confused about the counseling sessions, some of the things you've asked me to share, some of the exercises you've suggested." "Sarah, dear child," Pastor David interrupted, his voice taking on that patient, slightly condescending tone he used when correcting someone's theology. "You're still thinking with your wounded mind instead of trusting in spiritual wisdom. Remember what we've discussed about submission to spiritual authority? When you question my guidance, you're actually questioning God's will for your life. I should have announced my presence, should have cleared my throat, or knocked loudly on the doorframe. Instead, something kept me frozen in place, listening to a conversation that made my stomach tighten with unease. I know, Pastor. It's just that when you ask me to describe my personal experiences, my marriage problems in such detail, it makes me uncomfortable. And when you said that physical touch could be part of spiritual healing..." Sarah, Pastor David's voice grew firmer, more authoritative. "This is exactly the kind of worldly thinking that's preventing your complete healing. You've been damaged by improper male leadership, and now you're projecting those fears onto the pure spiritual guidance that God is providing through me. We've talked about this. Your resistance to proper spiritual authority is a symptom of the trauma you need to overcome. There was a long silence, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I'm sorry, Pastor. You're right. I know you only want what's best for me spiritually. I'll try to trust more completely. That's my dear girl. Pastor David's voice became warm again, almost caressing. God has such beautiful plans for your life, but you have to surrender completely to His guidance. Now, shall we continue with today's session? I believe we were discussing how to properly receive spiritual comfort. I heard the sound of chairs moving, and suddenly realized I needed to leave before they discovered me listening. I quietly backed away from the door and walked quickly around to the main entrance, my heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and something I wasn't ready to name as fear. Throughout that evening's visitation meeting, I found myself stealing glances at Sarah, trying to read her expression, looking for signs of the discomfort I had heard in her voice. But she appeared normal, perhaps a bit tired, but participating in the discussions about which homes to visit and what literature to share. When Pastor David assigned her to visit the Morrison family with Brother Jenkins, she accepted the assignment with a quiet, "Yes, Pastor," and made notes in her visitation journal just like always. That night, I lay awake beside Robert, replaying the conversation I had overheard. Part of me wondered if I had misunderstood, if my imagination was adding sinister undertones to what was simply an intense counseling session. Pastor David often spoke about the need for complete honesty in spiritual healing, and perhaps Sarah's discomfort was simply the natural resistance that people feel when confronting difficult truths about themselves. But another part of me, a part I tried to suppress, kept remembering the way Pastor David's voice had changed when he called Sarah my dear girl. The possessive warmth that seemed to have nothing to do with pastoral care and everything to do with something far more personal and inappropriate. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to Pastor David's interactions with the women in our congregation. What I began to notice troubled me deeply. During fellowship meals, he would stand unusually close to certain women while speaking with them, his hand resting on their shoulder or arm in ways that lasted just a moment too long. When he greeted the special counseling attendees with his customary handshake, I noticed his other hand would often touch their elbow or forearm, creating a double contact that seemed unnecessary and overly familiar. More disturbing were the subtle changes I observed in the women who were receiving his intensive spiritual guidance. Linda Chen, who had once been vibrant and intellectually curious, now seemed almost afraid to express any opinion without first checking Pastor David's face for approval. Helen Rodriguez had developed a nervous habit of twisting her wedding ring whenever Pastor David spoke directly to her, and I noticed she often seemed on the verge of tears during church services. Most unsettling of all was watching Sarah Mitchell's transformation. The young woman who had arrived at our church seeking healing and community was becoming increasingly isolated, even from the other women who wanted to befriend her. When I approached her after services to invite her for coffee or offer help with her daughter, she would glance quickly toward Pastor David before declining, as if seeking permission to accept or refuse social invitations. "Pastor David says I need to focus on my spiritual healing right now," she would explain apologetically. "He's concerned that too many social distractions might interfere with the progress I'm making in counseling. But thank you for thinking of me, Sister Elizabeth." The explanation always sounded rehearsed, as if she had been coached on how to deflect well-meaning overtures from other church members. And increasingly, I noticed that Sarah's spiritual healing seemed to require an enormous amount of Pastor David's personal attention. She was at the church for counseling sessions twice weekly, sometimes 3 times when she was dealing with what Pastor David described as spiritual breakthrough moments that required immediate pastoral intervention. One Wednesday afternoon, I had stopped by the church to deliver some items for the upcoming potluck dinner when I encountered Sarah leaving Pastor David's office. Her eyes were red-rimmed as if she had been crying, and her usually neat appearance seemed disheveled. When she saw me, she quickly looked away and hurried toward the exit without her usual polite greeting. "Sarah?" I called after her, but she paused only briefly. "I'm fine, Sister Elizabeth," she said without turning around. Just working through some difficult spiritual issues. Pastor David says the healing process can be emotionally challenging." But she didn't look fine. She looked frightened and ashamed, like someone carrying a secret too heavy for her shoulders. As I watched her practically flee from the building, I felt a growing certainty that something was very wrong with the spiritual healing taking place behind Pastor David's closed office door. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Linda Chen and asked if she would be willing to meet me for coffee on Saturday evening, after Sabbath ended. Linda seemed surprised by the invitation. Social gatherings among the women weren't typically encouraged unless they were specifically church-related activities. "I'd like that, Sister Elizabeth," she said carefully, "but I should probably check with Pastor David first. He's been helping me understand which friendships are spiritually beneficial and which ones might distract from my growth." The fact that a grown woman felt she needed pastoral permission to have coffee with another church member struck me as deeply troubling, but I kept my voice casual. "Of course, Linda. Just let me know what you decide." She called back the next day to say that Pastor David had approved our meeting, provided we focused our conversation on uplifting spiritual topics rather than worldly concerns or gossip. The list of restrictions he had given her for our coffee date was so detailed it seemed almost scripted. We could discuss our Bible study insights, share testimonies about God's leading in our lives, or talk about our church's mission work. But we were to avoid discussing personal struggles, family problems, or any negative feelings about church leadership. When we met at the small cafe on Main Street, Linda seemed nervous, constantly checking her watch and glancing toward the windows as if expecting to be observed. Our conversation felt stilted and artificial, with Linda carefully steering away from any topic that might violate Pastor David's guidelines. But as the evening progressed and we moved away from the prescribed safe subjects, I began to see glimpses of the intelligent, independent woman Linda had been before months of intensive spiritual counseling. "Sometimes I wonder what happened to the person I used to be," she said quietly, stirring her coffee with unnecessary attention. "Before I joined the church, I used to have opinions about things, used to make decisions without needing someone else's approval for everything." "You can still have opinions, Linda," I said gently. "God gave you a mind to use, not just to surrender to someone else's thinking." She looked up sharply, as if I had suggested something dangerously heretical. "Pastor David says that kind of thinking is what got women into trouble in the first place. That's how Satan deceived Eve, by encouraging her to trust her own judgment instead of submitting to proper spiritual authority." "But Linda," I pressed carefully, "you're an intelligent woman. You're studying to be a nurse, making important decisions about people's health and welfare. Surely God expects you to use your judgment in those situations." "That's different," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That's just worldly knowledge. Spiritual matters require spiritual guidance from someone who has the proper calling and training." We talked for another hour, and gradually, Linda began to open up about some of her doubts and concerns. She described counseling sessions that seemed to focus heavily on her past relationships, requiring her to share intimate details about her experiences with men before her conversion. She mentioned exercises that Pastor David had prescribed to help her overcome feminist rebellion, including practices that required her to seek his permission for various daily decisions and to report back to him about her thought patterns and emotional responses. "Sometimes the counseling feels invasive," she admitted reluctantly. "But Pastor David explains that real spiritual healing requires complete transparency. He says my discomfort is just evidence of how much work still needs to be done to overcome my worldly programming." As I listened to Linda describe her counseling experiences, a cold certainty settled in my chest. The pattern was unmistakable: isolation from supportive relationships, demands for increasingly intimate personal information, the systematic undermining of the woman's confidence in her own judgment and intuition. Pastor David wasn't providing spiritual guidance. He was implementing a careful program of psychological manipulation and control. The conversation with Linda opened my eyes to how systematically Pastor David had been exploiting the vulnerable women in our congregation. But it also made me realize how dangerous it would be to challenge him directly. Linda's response to my gentle questions showed how completely she had internalized his teachings about submission to spiritual authority. If I tried to warn her more explicitly about what I suspected, she would almost certainly report our conversation to Pastor David as evidence of my rebellious spirit or feminist influence. Over the next few weeks, I began to pay even closer attention to the dynamics within our church community. I noticed how Pastor David would often preach sermons that seemed specifically designed to reinforce the isolation and dependency of his counseling subjects. He would speak about the dangers of worldly friendships that might undermine spiritual growth, the importance of receiving guidance only from properly ordained spiritual leaders, and the subtle ways that Satan could use well-meaning church members to plant seeds of doubt about legitimate pastoral authority. There are some among us, he said during one particularly pointed sermon, who may be struggling with submission to spiritual leadership. They may try to influence others with their questions and doubts, not realizing they are being used as instruments of discord. We must be vigilant against such influences, beloved. When someone encourages you to question the guidance of your spiritual shepherd, you can be certain that this counsel is not coming from God. His eyes seemed to linger on me as he spoke those words, and I felt a chill of recognition. Somehow, he knew that I was beginning to see through his carefully constructed facade. Perhaps Linda had mentioned our conversation despite her promise of confidentiality, or perhaps my increased scrutiny of his behavior had become noticeable. Either way, I realized I was now under observation, my every word and action being evaluated for signs of disloyalty or rebellion. The realization that Pastor David was aware of my suspicions both terrified and galvanized me. I understood that I was now in a precarious position, isolated within my own church community, married to a man who revered our spiritual leader without question, surrounded by people who had been conditioned to view any criticism of pastoral authority as evidence of spiritual rebellion. But I also understood that I might be the only person in our congregation who was both aware of what was happening and in a position to do something about it. The women who were being directly victimized were too psychologically manipulated to recognize the abuse, too isolated to seek help, and too conditioned to submit to authority to speak out against their abuser. The other church members trusted Pastor David completely and would likely view any accusations against him as attacks on God's chosen servant. As I grappled with this terrible knowledge, I found myself remembering a conversation I had overheard between my mother and her sister many years ago, back when I was still a teenager living at home. They had been discussing a priest in their parish who had been quietly transferred to another diocese after rumors of inappropriate behavior with young parishioners. At the time, I hadn't fully understood what they were talking about, but I remembered my aunt's bitter comment. The church always protects its own, no matter who gets hurt in the process. Now, facing a similar situation in my own religious community, I began to understand the full weight of my aunt's words. Challenging Pastor David wouldn't just mean confronting one man's criminal behavior. It would mean challenging an entire system that was designed to protect spiritual leaders at the expense of those they were supposed to serve. The thought of what lay ahead terrified me. I knew that speaking out would almost certainly destroy my marriage, my friendships, my place in the only community I had known as an adult. Robert would never believe such accusations against our beloved pastor, and he would view my rebellion as evidence that I had been seduced by Satan's lies. The church members would rally around Pastor David, painting me as a bitter, mentally unstable woman who was trying to destroy God's work out of spite or jealousy. But as I watched Sarah Mitchell grow thinner and more withdrawn with each passing week, as I saw Linda Chen's vibrant personality disappearing under the weight of Pastor David's spiritual guidance, as I witnessed Helen Rodriguez's increasing emotional fragility, I knew I couldn't remain silent. These women were being systematically destroyed by a man who used their faith against them, who turned their love for God into a weapon for his own gratification. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in early October. I had stopped by the church to pick up some materials for the upcoming evangelistic series when I heard raised voices coming from Pastor David's office. This time, the door was fully closed, but the voices were loud enough to carry through the wooden panels. "Please, Pastor, I can't do this anymore." Sarah's voice was thick with tears and desperation. "This isn't spiritual counseling. This isn't healing. This is wrong, and you know it's wrong. Sarah, you're having a spiritual crisis." Pastor David's voice was calm but firm. "Satan is trying to convince you that God's healing process is somehow sinful. This is exactly what we've been working toward. The moment when your old, wounded self tries to reassert control instead of submitting to divine guidance. No. Sarah's voice became stronger, more determined. I've been reading my Bible, really reading it, not just studying the passages you assign. And nothing in Scripture supports what you've been asking me to do. Nothing justifies the way you've been touching me, the things you've required me to share, the physical aspects of these sessions. There was a long silence, and when Pastor David spoke again, his voice had taken on a harder edge that I had never heard before. Sarah, you're making a very serious mistake. Do you understand what will happen if you start spreading lies about my ministry? Do you realize how this congregation will react when they learn that you're trying to destroy their spiritual leader with false accusations? They're not false accusations, and you know it, Sarah said. But I could hear the fear creeping back into her voice. Who do you think they'll believe, Sarah? A divorced woman with a history of mental instability, or their ordained pastor who has served faithfully for years? Who do you think will take responsibility for your daughter when Child Services learns that her mother is having psychological breakdowns and making delusional accusations against respected community leaders? The cruelty in his voice, the calculated way he was using Sarah's vulnerabilities against her, crystallized my resolve. This wasn't just spiritual abuse. It was psychological terrorism, and it had to be stopped. I quietly left the church and drove home through the rain, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. That night, as Robert slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, composing the words I would need to speak, preparing for the battle that I knew was coming. The next Saturday would change everything. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually filled me with anticipation for our Sabbath worship. But as I dressed in my navy blue skirt and white blouse, my hands trembled so violently I could barely fasten the buttons. Robert had already left for his early morning responsibilities as head deacon, which meant I would have to face what was coming without even the comfort of his presence beside me, however disapproving that presence might soon become. The church was fuller than usual that morning. Word had spread through our small community about the special evangelistic series beginning the following week, and several visitors had come to observe our worship service. I recognized the faces of potential converts, curious neighbors, and even a few members from other Adventist churches in the region who had come to hear Pastor David's renowned preaching. As I took my usual seat in the third pew from the front, I noticed Sarah Mitchell sitting alone near the back of the sanctuary. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on her hands, folded in her lap. She looked like someone who had spent the night wrestling with angels and losing. Across the aisle, Linda Chen sat with her characteristic perfect posture, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing nervously toward Pastor David's office door. The opening hymn was, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and as our small congregation sang those familiar words about battling against the Prince of Darkness, I felt the irony piercing through my chest like a knife. We were singing about defeating evil, while the very man leading our worship was the one bringing darkness into our midst. Pastor David took the pulpit with his usual commanding presence, his silver hair gleaming under the sanctuary lights, his voice resonating with the authority that had once comforted me so deeply. His sermon that morning was about Ephesians chapter 6, putting on the whole armor of God to stand against the wiles of the devil. He spoke eloquently about spiritual warfare, about the need to discern between true servants of God and those who would come disguised as angels of light. "The enemy is subtle, beloved," he declared, his eyes sweeping across the congregation with practiced sincerity. "He doesn't always come as a roaring lion. Sometimes he comes whispering lies into the ears of those who should be most loyal to God's work. Sometimes he plants seeds of suspicion and discord in the hearts of church members, turning them against their spiritual shepherds." As he spoke, I felt his gaze rest on me for just a moment longer than normal, and I saw something in his eyes that confirmed my worst fears. He knew that I had been listening, had been watching, had been putting together the pieces of his carefully concealed predatory behavior. This sermon wasn't just general spiritual instruction. It was a warning, a preemptive strike designed to discredit anything I might be planning to say. The service continued with special music, announcements about the upcoming evangelistic meetings, and a particularly lengthy prayer where Pastor David asked God to protect the church from divisive influences and false accusations that might arise to harm his work. Every word felt like it was aimed directly at me, designed to paint me as the enemy before I could even open my mouth. When Pastor David finally concluded his sermon and opened the service for testimonies and prayer requests, the sanctuary fell into the familiar quiet expectancy that marked this portion of our worship. Usually, this time was filled with gratitude for answered prayers, requests for healing for sick family members, and thanksgiving for God's blessings during the week. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly stood up from my seat. The rustling of my skirt seemed impossibly loud in the hushed sanctuary. I could feel every eye in the room turning toward me, could sense the expectant smiles of church members who assumed I was about to share some routine testimony about God's goodness in my life. "Brothers and sisters," I began, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I need to share something with you that is difficult and painful, but absolutely necessary." I saw Pastor David's expression shift almost imperceptibly, the practiced smile remaining on his lips, but something colder entering his eyes. Behind him, Margaret Richardson sat at the piano bench, her face a mask of polite attention that betrayed no awareness of what was about to unfold. "For months now, I have been observing behaviors in our church leadership that deeply concern me," I continued, my voice growing stronger as the words I had rehearsed through countless sleepless nights finally found their way into the light. "I have watched as vulnerable women in our congregation have been isolated, manipulated, and abused under the guise of spiritual counseling." The silence in the sanctuary became absolute. I could see shock, confusion, and disbelief rippling across the faces of my fellow church members. Someone in the back pews gasped audibly. Robert, sitting in his deacon's chair near the front, looked as if I had physically struck him. "Sister Elizabeth," Pastor David's voice cut through the tension with practiced calm, "I can see that you're upset about something. Perhaps this would be better discussed privately, in a more appropriate setting." But I knew that if I allowed myself to be silenced now, if I retreated into private discussion where his manipulative skills could be brought to bear without witnesses, the truth would be buried forever, and more women would suffer. "No, Pastor David," I said, turning to face him directly. "This needs to be said publicly, because the abuse has been happening publicly, hidden in plain sight, while all of us chose not to see it." I turned back to the congregation, many of whom were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, whispering among themselves, clearly uncertain about what they were witnessing. "Sarah Mitchell," I said, looking directly at the young woman in the back pew, "you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. What he has done to you in the name of spiritual counseling is not healing. It is abuse. It is not God's will. It is one man's sin being covered by his position of authority." Sarah's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. But she didn't deny my words, and her reaction spoke louder than any verbal confirmation could have. "Linda Chen, Helen Rodriguez," I continued, "you have been systematically isolated and controlled. Your natural instincts and judgment undermined by a man who has used your faith against you. The confusion and self-doubt you feel isn't spiritual growth. It's the result of psychological manipulation." "That's enough," Pastor David's voice boomed through the sanctuary, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "This woman is clearly having some kind of mental breakdown. What you're witnessing is a deeply troubled individual making wild, unfounded accusations against God's servant." But before he could continue his counterattack, something extraordinary happened. Sarah Mitchell stood up from her seat in the back pew, her face streaked with tears but her voice clear and strong. "She's telling the truth," Sarah said, her words carrying to every corner of the silent sanctuary. "Pastor David has been abusing his position, using his authority to force women into situations that have nothing to do with spiritual counseling and everything to do with his own gratification." The explosion of voices that followed her confirmation was immediate and chaotic. Some church members rose from their seats in shock, others began talking loudly among themselves, and a few of the visitors quietly slipped toward the exits. Pastor David began speaking rapidly, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice was lost in the growing tumult. Then Linda Chen stood up, her face pale but determined. "Sarah is right," she said simply. I've been too afraid to admit it, even to myself. But what happened in those counseling sessions wasn't spiritual guidance. It was abuse. One by one, other women began to stand. Not just the ones I had suspected, but others whose involvement I hadn't even known about. Each confirmation was like another stone thrown at a carefully constructed facade, and I watched Pastor David's empire of manipulation begin to crumble before our eyes. The truth, once released, could not be contained. The aftermath of that Saturday morning revelation was unlike anything our small congregation had ever experienced. What had begun as a routine worship service had transformed into something that would fundamentally alter the lives of everyone present. The sanctuary, which moments before had been filled with the respectful quiet of Sabbath worship, now buzzed with shocked conversations, tears, and the kind of emotional chaos that comes when long-held beliefs are suddenly shattered. Pastor David attempted to regain control of the situation, his voice rising above the din as he called for order and calm. "Brothers and sisters, please," he said, his hands raised in a gesture that had once commanded immediate respect and attention. "We are witnessing a coordinated attack on God's work here. These accusations are the result of a spirit of rebellion that has been allowed to take root in our congregation." But his words no longer carried their former power. The spell had been broken, and I could see doubt creeping into faces that had once regarded him with unquestioning reverence. Robert stood frozen in his deacon's chair, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, anger, and something that might have been the first stirrings of horrible recognition. Margaret Richardson had risen from the piano bench and now stood beside her husband, her face a mask of composure that couldn't quite hide the tremor in her hands. For the first time since I had known her, she looked directly at the women who were speaking out, and I saw something in her eyes that suggested this might not be the complete shock to her that it appeared to be to everyone else. "These are serious accusations," said Brother Martinez, one of our elders, his voice carrying the authority of someone trying to restore order to chaos. "If there is truth to what's being said, it needs to be investigated properly through official church channels, not aired publicly like this." Official church channels? Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the noise, stronger now than I had heard it in months. "Do you mean the same official channels that allowed this to continue for years? The same system that moves problematic pastors from church to church instead of addressing their behavior?" Her words carried a weight of knowledge that surprised me. Somehow, Sarah had learned about Pastor David's history, about the pattern of behavior that had brought him to our church in the first place. Linda Chen stepped forward, her nursing training apparent in the clinical precision with which she spoke. "I've been documenting everything," she said quietly, but her words carried clearly through the sanctuary. Dates, times, specific incidents. I started keeping records because the counseling sessions were so unusual that I wanted to track my spiritual progress, as Pastor David called it. I realize now that I was unconsciously creating evidence. The impact of her statement was immediate. Several church members who had been defending Pastor David fell silent, perhaps beginning to understand that this wasn't just emotional testimony, but potentially documented evidence of systematic abuse. Pastor David's face had gone pale, but he continued his attempts to control the narrative. "Linda, dear child, you've obviously misunderstood the nature of advanced pastoral counseling. What you've interpreted as inappropriate was simply intensive spiritual guidance that your inexperience led you to mischaracterize." "Don't you dare call me dear child ever again." Linda's response was sharp, her voice carrying an authority I hadn't heard from her in months. "I'm a grown woman, a trained professional, and I know the difference between legitimate counseling and manipulation. What you did to me, to all of us, was calculate and predatory." Helen Rodriguez had been standing silently since her initial confirmation, but now she spoke for the first time. "There are others," she said simply. "Women who aren't here today, women who left the church rather than continue to endure what was happening. Women who moved away, women who stopped attending without explanation. We weren't his first victims, and if this had continued, we wouldn't have been his last." The weight of her words settled over the congregation like a shroud. I could see church members beginning to remember other women who had disappeared from our fellowship over the years, departures that had been explained as spiritual backsliding or family situations, but which now took on a far more sinister significance. Mrs. Peterson, the retired schoolteacher who had once expressed concerns about Pastor David's counseling methods, stood up from her seat near the middle of the sanctuary. "I should have spoken up years ago," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I saw things that made me uncomfortable, heard conversations that didn't seem appropriate for pastoral care. But I told myself I was being old-fashioned, that I didn't understand modern ministry methods." Her admission seemed to open floodgates of recognition among other church members. I watched as people began to acknowledge warning signs they had ignored, uncomfortable moments they had dismissed, patterns of behavior they had chosen not to see because the implications were too disturbing to contemplate. Robert finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Elizabeth," he said, looking at me as if I were a stranger, "how long have you known about this? How long have you been investigating our pastor without telling me?" The hurt in his voice cut through me like a blade. I could see that he felt betrayed not just by Pastor David's behavior, but by my silence, my secret investigation, my decision to handle this publicly rather than coming to him first. "I've suspected for weeks," I admitted, my voice gentler now as I addressed my husband directly. "But Robert, I knew you wouldn't believe me if I came to you with suspicions. I knew you'd think I was being influenced by Satan, or jealous of Pastor David's ministry, or suffering from some kind of spiritual rebellion. I had to be certain, and I had to find a way to make the truth undeniable." The pain in Robert's eyes told me that my assessment had been accurate and that knowledge brought me no satisfaction. I was destroying not just our church community, but potentially my marriage, in order to protect women who might never thank me for the devastation my honesty was causing. The visitors who had come to observe our service had largely fled by this point, their curiosity about Adventist worship thoroughly satisfied in ways they had never anticipated. The remaining congregation was made up entirely of regular members, people whose lives were intertwined with the church community and who couldn't simply walk away from what was unfolding. Brother Jenkins, who had been serving as assistant pastor under Pastor David's mentorship, stood up with obvious reluctance. "We need to contact the conference administration immediately," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "This congregation cannot handle a situation of this magnitude on its own. We need guidance from church leaders who have experience with these kinds of problems." Pastor David finally seemed to realize that his authority was completely undermined, that no amount of spiritual rhetoric or accusations of rebellion were going to restore his position. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked like an ordinary man rather than a commanding spiritual leader. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation rather than authority. "This church has grown and prospered under my leadership. Families have been brought to Christ, lives have been changed, God's work has been advanced. Are you willing to destroy all of that for the sake of a few misunderstandings?" "Misunderstandings?" Sarah's voice rose sharply. "Is that what you call sexual abuse disguised as spiritual counseling? Is that what you call using your position of trust to manipulate and exploit vulnerable women?" The word sexual hung in the air like an electric charge. Until that moment, the accusations had been somewhat vague, couched in terms of inappropriate counseling and abuse of authority. But Sarah's explicit statement removed any possibility of misinterpretation or minimization. Margaret Richardson suddenly stepped away from her husband, the movement subtle but unmistakable to everyone watching. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but clear enough to be heard throughout the sanctuary. "I've known," she said simply. "Not the details, not the extent, but I've known something was wrong for years. I told myself it was just his passionate commitment to helping people, his intense care for struggling church members. I chose not to look too closely because I was afraid of what I might find." Her admission completed the collapse of Pastor David's position. If his own wife acknowledged awareness of problematic behavior, no one could continue to claim that the accusations were fabricated or exaggerated. The next hour passed in a blur of difficult conversations, tears, and the kind of painful honesty that reshapes relationships forever. Church members who had been close friends found themselves on opposite sides of painful divides. Some rallied around the women who had spoken out, offering support and apologies for not seeing the signs sooner. Others, particularly some of the older men who had worked closely with Pastor David in church leadership, struggled to reconcile their admiration for his ministry with the growing evidence of his misconduct. By the time the conference president arrived that evening, accompanied by a team of administrators trained in handling pastoral misconduct, Pastor David had already left town. Margaret remained to face the investigation, but her husband had simply vanished, leaving behind his church, his congregation, and the wreckage of lives he had damaged in pursuit of his own gratification. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of my life. The investigation confirmed everything we had revealed and uncovered additional victims from Pastor David's previous assignments. But validation came at a tremendous personal cost. Robert's faith was shattered, not just in Pastor David, but in the entire church structure that had allowed such abuse to continue. Our marriage became strained to the breaking point as he struggled to process the destruction of everything he had believed about spiritual authority and divine protection. Some church members blamed me for bringing down their beloved leader, suggesting that I could have handled the situation more quietly, more gracefully, in ways that wouldn't have destroyed the congregation's unity and reputation in the community. Others thanked me for my courage, but seemed uncomfortable around me, as if my willingness to challenge authority made me a potentially dangerous person to have in their midst. But despite the personal cost, despite the painful aftermath and the slow process of healing that lay ahead, I knew I had made the right choice. The women who had been suffering in silence were finally free to begin their recovery. The pattern of abuse that had continued for years across multiple congregations had finally been broken. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes protecting the innocent requires destroying the structures that shelter the guilty, even when those structures include your own life. 5 years have passed since that devastating Saturday morning, when truth shattered the carefully constructed world of our small Adventist congregation. As I sit in my kitchen this quiet Sunday afternoon, watching the golden autumn light filter through the curtains I sewed myself 3 years ago, I can finally say that the wounds have begun to heal, though the scars remain as permanent reminders of lessons learned at tremendous cost. The immediate aftermath was more painful than I could have anticipated. Within 6 months of Pastor David's disappearance and the subsequent investigation, our congregation had dwindled from 40 active members to fewer than 15. Some families transferred to other Adventist churches in neighboring towns, unable to bear the shame and gossip that followed our community wherever we went. Others, like Robert, simply stopped attending church altogether, their faith too damaged to sustain continued participation in organized religion. Robert and I separated for 8 months. The man I had married couldn't reconcile himself to the woman who had destroyed his spiritual universe, even though he intellectually understood the necessity of my actions. He moved into a small apartment above the hardware store and worked longer hours than ever, as if physical exhaustion could quiet the questions that tormented his mind during quiet moments. "I know you did the right thing," he told me during one of our painful conversations in the lawyer's office where we were discussing divorce proceedings. "I know Pastor David was a predator and that women were being hurt. But Elizabeth, you destroyed everything I believed about God, about church, about authority, about truth. I don't know how to rebuild a life from that kind of devastation." The divorce papers were never filed. Something about the Christmas season of that difficult year softened both our hearts enough to attempt reconciliation. Robert began seeing a counselor, not a pastor or spiritual advisor, but a licensed therapist who helped him process the trauma of discovering that his spiritual father had been a wolf in shepherd's clothing. Slowly, painfully, we learned to build a marriage based on honest communication rather than shared religious authority structures. We never returned to organized religion. Sunday mornings in our house now involve long walks in the state park, quiet conversations over coffee, and a kind of spiritual reflection that feels more authentic than any formal worship service I ever attended. Robert still struggles with faith questions, but he no longer looks to human leaders for divine guidance. "If God exists," he says, "I figure he's big enough to communicate with me directly without needing a middleman who might have his own agenda." Sarah Mitchell proved to be stronger than any of us had imagined. After the initial trauma of publicly confronting her abuser, she seemed to bloom like a flower finally receiving adequate sunlight. She completed her GED, enrolled in community college, and eventually became a victim's advocate specializing in religious abuse cases. Her daughter, now 9 years old, is growing up with a mother who models courage, independence, and the kind of faith that doesn't require submission to harmful authority. "You saved my life," Sarah told me last spring when she visited to deliver a copy of her bachelor's degree. "Not just from Pastor David, but from the mindset that made me vulnerable to people like him. I'm teaching my daughter to question everything, to trust her instincts, and to never let anyone use God's name to make her do things that feel wrong." Linda Chen finished her nursing degree and now works in the psychiatric unit at the regional hospital. She married a fellow nurse, a kind, gentle man who supports her advocacy work with religious abuse survivors. Linda has become something of an expert on the psychological techniques used by spiritual predators, and she frequently speaks at conferences for mental health professionals about recognizing and treating victims of religious trauma. "The most insidious part," she explained to me during one of our annual coffee meetings, "is how they use your own faith against you. They make you believe that resisting their abuse is the same as resisting God." Recovery requires learning to separate authentic spirituality from the control mechanisms that predators attach to it. Helen Rodriguez sold her farm and moved to the city to be closer to her adult children. The change of environment helped her heal from years of manipulation and control. She joined a progressive Methodist church that emphasizes social justice over rigid doctrine. And she volunteers with an organization that helps women leave abusive religious communities. The investigation into Pastor David's history revealed a pattern spanning more than 15 years and affecting dozens of women across 4 different states. He had been quietly transferred from congregation to congregation whenever rumors or complaints began to surface, with church administrators choosing institutional protection over victim welfare. The conference eventually settled multiple lawsuits and implemented new policies for handling misconduct allegations, though critics argue the changes are insufficient. Pastor David himself was never prosecuted. By the time law enforcement became involved, too many years had passed for criminal charges to be viable in most cases. He disappeared into a different state, and last anyone heard, he was working as a sales representative for a religious publishing company. The knowledge that he escaped legal consequences still burns in my chest sometimes, but I've learned to find peace in knowing that his ability to harm women through spiritual authority has been permanently ended. Mrs. Peterson, the retired schoolteacher who had recognized warning signs years earlier, became an unexpected ally in the healing process. She organized support groups for former congregation members and helped connect our local survivors with resources and counseling services. Her guilt over not speaking up sooner motivated years of volunteer work with organizations fighting spiritual abuse. "I learned that good people staying silent is how evil people stay in power," she told me with characteristic directness. "I'll never make that mistake again." The small group of church members who remained committed to Adventist faith eventually merged with a congregation 2 towns over. They invited Robert and me to join them, promising a fresh start and new leadership, but we declined. The institutional structure that had protected Pastor David for so long seemed irreparably compromised to us, regardless of the sincere efforts of individual members to create safer communities. Some people in our town still view me as the woman who destroyed a church. At the grocery store or the post office, I occasionally catch whispered conversations and sideways glances from people who believe I should have handled things differently, more quietly, with greater concern for institutional reputation. But I also receive letters from women across the country who read news accounts of our situation and found the courage to confront their own experiences with spiritual abuse. "Your story gave me permission to trust my own instincts," wrote one woman from Oregon. "I'd been telling myself for years that the problems in my church were in my head, that I was being too sensitive or rebellious. Reading about your courage helped me realize that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is refuse to enable evil, even when that evil is hiding behind religious authority." These letters sustain me during moments when I wonder if the devastation was worth it. Each woman who finds her voice, each congregation that implements better safeguards, each spiritual leader who thinks twice before exploiting their position represents a victory that extends far beyond our small community. Looking back, I understand that my life divided into 2 distinct chapters that Saturday morning 5 years ago. Before, I was Elizabeth, the obedient church member, seeking approval from human authorities and confusing submission with spirituality. After, I became Elizabeth, the truth-teller, willing to pay any personal cost to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their faith. The second version of myself is harder to live with some days, but she's also more authentic, more genuinely connected to whatever divine presence might exist in this complicated world. She knows that real faith sometimes requires destroying false idols, even when those idols wear clerical collars and speak in the name of God. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with this. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.